On this Shabbat Hagadol, we heard Sasha chant those daunting words from the Haftarah, from the prophet Malachi. Through his mouth, God said, "On that day which I am preparing, Eliyahu Hanavi, Elijah the prophet, will come, and you shall return to be able to see the difference between righteousness and wickedness. You will be able to discern between the righteous and the wicked." This implies the prophet's understanding that today and in his time, we lack the ability to discern between the righteous and the wicked. A mark of Yemot HaMashiach, of that messianic age, which is all peace and all justice and all perfection, that time which is always eluding us just on the horizon, that is when we will know, as God knows, how to discern between the righteous and the wicked. With Pesach just around the corner now, when we turn our thoughts to the themes of freedom and how freedom through justice can be shared with more and more of humanity, I've woven together a number of teachings from Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, in part to honor Sasha's father, Rob Steiner, who loves the teachings of Heschel almost as much as I do. Indifference to evil is worse than evil itself. That in a free society, some are guilty, but all are responsible. These are the famous words of Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel of blessed memory. Indifference to evil is worse than evil itself. The Pesach story is a lesson in cracking open such indifference. It may have been that Pharaoh was guilty, but all of the Egyptians of his day were responsible for the oppression of the Israelites because they did nothing to change the slavery situation. It seems that God must have agreed, because remember, those 10 plagues were intended for all Egyptians. God could have jumped to the end and only threatened Pharaoh to teach him a lesson of indifference, to punish the wicked accordingly. And yet, instead, plague after plague rained down upon all of the Egyptians, while Pharaoh himself was hiding safely in his palace. I'm afraid that we too often hide safely in our palaces. Heschel says to us today, an individual dies when he or she ceases to be surprised. And there I would put in parentheses, surprised by the morning news. He continues, I am surprised every morning when I see the sun shining again. When I see an act of evil, I do not accommodate. I don't accommodate myself to the violence that goes on everywhere. I am still so surprised. And that is why I am against it. We must learn how to be surprised. Heschel speaks in the line of the prophets, who were also aghast by the wrongs they saw in their own time. How do we put ourselves in this line of the prophets, in the line of Heschel? How do we make ourselves more capable of surprise? A few weeks ago, I was surprised when, at a rabbinical conference in Atlanta, I heard from the president of the NAACP, Cornell William Brooks. He taught us to shake us and rattle us, 500 rabbis gathered there, that the United States holds 5% of the world's population, and yet inside U.S. prisons are approximately 25% of all the prisoners of the world. Black men are imprisoned at more than 6 times the rate of white men in America. Brooks says, "The land of the free is the home of the incarcerated." And while he focused on voter suppression and mass incarceration, it seems that the former is really an issue of the United States that is less our concern here in Canada, thank God. But the latter, this theme, this surprise of mass incarceration, is absolutely our concern here as well. Canada's crime rate has hit a 45-year low. This is reason to celebrate. And yet, there has been a 17% increase in the federal prison population over the last 10 years, despite year-over-year reductions in crime rates. 70% more Black Canadians in federal prisons are today than there were 10 years ago. We are not immune to racial injustices and racial profiling. We're not even aware of how deep run the channels of racial prejudice in this country. Indigenous Canadians make up just 4.3% of the general population, but account for 24.4% of the federal prison population. How can that be? The rate of Indigenous incarceration grew by 50% in the last 10 years. The Indigenous incarceration rate in Canada is 10 times higher than the non-Indigenous population for imprisonment. This is shockingly higher than even South Africa at the height of apartheid. I could go on with these statistics, but it is Shabbat, and they're hard to repeat. Just one more out of all of these that are hard to say. Indigenous incarceration rates for women are up 112% in the last decade. Anthony Morgan is a Toronto-based lawyer and Canadian rights advocate. He teaches us that this mass incarceration problem is not a uniquely American problem, and that we turn to what happened south of the border in a way to let ourselves off the hook. He writes, "It has a lot to do with what I've called Canadian racial exceptionalism. If America is having a conversation about the hyper-incarceration of Black males in order to maintain our sense of moral superiority, we cannot look into those issues as we experience them here in Canada." He notes that in reality, overrepresentation of the Black population in prisons is 37% of the prison population. We're not, as a country, ready to contest this, he says, because of the myths we tell ourselves about multiculturalism and thinking that we've got it all figured out. The truth of the matter is that when you look in our prison systems, if you go to our courthouses, if you go to children's aid offices, to school detention halls, it is overwhelmingly Black children who are being criminalized and punished. In an op-ed piece in 2013, the well-known, well-respected Canadian David Clayton Thomas, the lead singer for Blood, Sweat, and Tears, told a little bit of his own story. He wrote for the Globe and Mail, I was just one of thousands of lost homeless kids you see on the streets every day. I was not beyond redemption. They just treated me as if I was. The lessons of prison guarantee failure after release. In no time I was back, recycled for 4 more years in hellholes like the Burwash Industrial Farm, a notorious labor camp south of Sudbury that has since been closed. A staggering 90% of young offenders sent to prison reoffend within 2 years, according to a recent Manitoba government report. And meanwhile, despite evidence that it is ineffective policy, the federal government, referring to 2013, is, quote unquote, getting tough on crime and imposing mandatory sentencing and building more prisons to house more criminals, even as the crime rate continues to fall. More and more prisoners show up with mental illnesses. They don't get better in jail. They get worse. The fact that the Jewish community has not taken this issue up as one of its own is surprising to me, I must admit. The Jewish community here at Holy Blossom Temple certainly was activated by civil rights. We brought Dr. Martin Luther King to address us from this very bima, and we sent him back with a generous check to support his efforts. Why haven't we taken up this issue now? I don't know. I look back to my grandfather's model for inspiration every day, but especially as we approach Pesach. My grandfather, Rabbi Ernst Lorge, Alav HaShalom, was the chair of the Toronto Board of Rabbis in the early 1960s in Chicago. And he was one of the 3 faith leaders who hosted the 1963 National Conference on Race and Religion in Chicago. That conference got the praise and attention from President Kennedy, but perhaps more importantly, it was the conference which introduced my grandfather's teacher, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, to the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. They both were at that conference. King was the keynote speaker, and Heschel gave the opening address. They were friends for the years that followed, dear friends. In fact, you might know that King was invited to Heschel's Seder table in 1968. And they were both looking forward to it so much. But King's life was taken just days before, and so Heschel had to give a psalm at his funeral instead. But at that national conference in 1963 on race and religion, Heschel addressed the crowd, saying, "Remember that the first conference on race and religion were the main participants, Pharaoh and Moses. The outcome of that summit has not come to an end. Pharaoh is still not ready to capitulate. The Exodus has begun, but it is far from having been completed." He writes, "Few of us seem to realize how insidious, how radical, how universal and evil racism is. Few of us realize that racism is man's gravest threat to man, the maximum of hatred for a minimum of reason, the maximum of cruelty for a minimum of thinking." So if our Canadian system is prejudiced, prejudges Canadians of color, then we can take up the mitzvah in our response. We can take up the mitzvah of redeeming the captives, working to free those who are not justly imprisoned. According to Maimonides, the 12th century giant of Jewish law, there is no greater mitzvah than pidyon shvuyim, redeeming the rightful, the unrightful, unjust captives. Mitzvah rabahi, he says. This mitzvah supersedes the mitzvot of giving food or clothing to the poor. There is no greater mitzvah than this, because the problems of the illegitimately imprisoned captive includes the problems of the hungry and the thirsty and the lonely and the naked and the one in mortal danger. Any delay in fulfilling this mitzvah, according to Maimonides, is tantamount to transgressing the mitzvot of "you shall not stand idly by as your neighbor bleeds," And you shall not harden your heart, as Pharaoh did, nor shut your hand against your kinsman who is in need. We also break the mitzvah, that central tenet, to love our neighbor as ourselves. Maimonides concludes his legal writings on the matter by ruling without exaggeration, for every moment that one delays in freeing the captives, when he or she could expedite their freedom, it is considered as if he or she committed murder. And Maimonides was not a man of hyperbole. He chose his words with extreme care. God forbid we should be like that fourth child at the Seder table, she'eno yodea lish'ol, the one who doesn't even know how to ask a question about this issue, which is alive and well in our country. What does the Haggadah instruct us to do for the one who does not even know where to begin to ask a question? You shall tell that child, you shall tell that person, this freedom of Pesach has been granted me when I came forth from the land of Egypt. We must make it personal. We must reflect upon our own freedom so that then we can work for the freedoms of others. We must not be ignorant or, like Pharaoh, hiding in a palace of protection. And so on May 10th, after we've recovered and have been inspired by Pesach, we will gather here at Holy Blossom Temple, I believe it's a Wednesday evening, to hear from Desmond Cole, who is a journalist and activist in Toronto. He wrote that Toronto Life magazine feature article, The Skin I'm In, where he spoke about how he has been treated as a Canadian man of color. And we'll also hear from the director of the recent 45-minute documentary, The Skin We're In. That director is Charles Officer, and the producer, one of the producers of that film, is our own Jake Yanowski. They will speak personally about why they have made that film, and they will invite us to join in the mitzvah of working for racial justice in our city, in our country. What is slavery? Deep down. Simply put, slaves exist to fulfill the needs and commands of others, with no possibility for choice or expression of their own. Slavery involves taking a person who is an end unto him or herself and making that person a means to another's end. In that respect, slavery is not a historical curiosity. Even without whips or chains today, from the traffic of women to migrant labor to mass incarceration, sadly, the idea of slavery, even if we do not call it that, is still very much with us. Let me conclude with one more teaching from Heschel and then a poem of uplift. In order for us to address this shameful reality, which may be hidden in the streets of Toronto and must be brought to light, Heschel addresses us when he says, Judaism is an attempt to prove that in order to be a human being, you have to be more than a human being. And in order to be a people, we have to be more than a people. Just yesterday, I circulated a little gift to the congregation, a little poem penned by the chemist and writer and survivor of Auschwitz, Primo Levi. This Pesach poem is translated from his original Italian. Tell me, how is this night different from all other nights? How, tell me, is this Passover different from all other Passovers? Light the lamp and open the door wide, so that the pilgrim may enter, be he Gentile or Jew. Perhaps the prophet Elijah is concealed under his rags. Let him enter and sit down with us. Let him listen, drink, sing, and celebrate Pesach. Let him consume the bread of affliction, and the paschal lamb, and the sweet mortar, and the bitter herbs. For this is the night of discernment. The night we eat the bread of affliction, the night we lean our elbows on the table, since the forbidden is made prescribed, and evil is translated into good. We will spend the night recounting far-off events full of wonder, and because of all the wine, the hills will prance like rams. Tonight they exchange questions, the wise, the wicked, the simple-minded, and the child. And time reverses its course, today flowing back into yesterday like a river, enclosed at its mouth. Each of us has been a slave in Egypt, has soaked straw and clay with sweat, and crossed the sea, dry-footed. You too, stranger. This year in fear and shame, next year in virtue and justice. Amen.